My name is Matt Holder, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Commission. And joining me today is
Riece Baker, investigator at the Real Estate Commission.
and Riece, go ahead and tell us about what the key terms are that licensees need to know.
Sure. So as we're going through these cases, you're going to hear some of these terms. The complainant is obviously the complaining party. They become a witness for the state. Sometimes the complainant will assume that they are going to be the plaintiff, but the state is actually the plaintiff, and the complainant becomes a witness for the state. The respondent is the person or entity in which the complaint is about. A formal hearing is similar to a trial. All parties state their case before a hearing examiner or administrative law judge. Sometimes we'll refer to them as an ALJ. A consent agreement is similar to a plea bargain. Parties consent to findings in lieu of a hearing. Post-COVID, that's typically what we will try to reach in almost any case. We'll try to reach a consent agreement as opposed to going to a hearing. A revocation is a minimum term of 5 years before a applicant can make reapplication, and a suspension is at the discretion of the commission. So that can be anywhere from 30 days to up to 5 years.
So most often people do go with the consent agreement.
Yes. Similar to a plea bargain, it's usually a more favorable outcome for the respondent if they would go ahead and consent. Hearings cost us money. We have to hire the judge, prosecutor, and court reporter, and so it really is a trial.
And so it's costing them more time too.
Yes.
So talk to us about the investigations process.
Sure. So a complaint is filed through the portal, and then it is reviewed by the team of investigators. They're typically assigned randomly. We always check to make sure that there aren't any conflicts before we move forward with our preliminary investigation. If a case is open, the respondents are notified, and they have to respond within 15 days. The investigators will then review all of the documents, and we will write a report, and we will send that information over to our prosecutor, which becomes the case examiner. Typically, that is the Attorney General's office. They will make a recommendation either to go to a hearing or dismiss. Sometimes we can close with a letter of caution or sort of a combination of those types of things. If a hearing is conducted, the hearing examiner will then make a recommendation to the commissioners, and they will make the final determination of whatever we decide is the best course of action as far as discipline goes.
Awesome. So now now that we've discussed the investigations process, we're going to get into the first case study, which is going to be the complaint was the broker double contracted a property on a verbal discussion. So talk to us about what happened here.
Correct. So this broker had a property listed. They went under contract pretty quickly with buyer number one. Sometime during the inspection period, there was some discussion between buyer number one's broker and the list broker. The conversation was something like, they're not feeling great about it. We don't know if they're for sure going to move forward, but we're going to sleep on it, and then we'll discuss more in the morning. But sort of the consensus was that the buyers weren't feeling great about it. Well, in the meantime, the broker presents an offer to the sellers, and they actually accept that offer. Of course, when the morning comes, everybody's feeling better about it, and buyer one decides that they're going to move forward, and buyer two decides that he's going to move forward as well. And so then we have
It creates a little bit of a conflict.
Yes, then we have two buyers that both want to move forward with this transaction. And this was a situation also that had like domino contingencies.
Okay.
And so the seller in this case had a contingency to purchase another property. That seller had a contingency to purchase another property, and this was throughout multiple states. And so it ended up being a domino effect. And the consumer in this case was harmed monetarily. And so, of course, they both filed a complaint. Both buyers filed a complaint on the same list broker. And it ended up taking a while for us to sort of get to, because it was also in a civil dispute. And so anytime a case that is ours also becomes a civil dispute, we have to, what we call, hold that case in abeyance. So we kind of just put it on hold until the civil action is complete, so that we don't affect the outcome of that civil trial.
So can you give some examples of some complaints that we get that are actually more civil issues and not uh, commission-related issues?
Sure, we get quite a few landlord tenant issues, which in and of itself kind of isn't our problem, but those usually end up being civil problems. Commission disputes between licensees, those end up being civil. Um, uh, Maybe a commission dispute with a broker and an agent, those are typically civil issues. Most often, if we get complaints about a material defect,
Mhm.
that typically ends up being a civil issue between the buyer and the seller.
So if you have any of those types of issues, those are not for to be filed with OREC. Those are retain your own counsel if you choose to move forward.
Correct.
So talk to us about the penalty on case study number one with these double contracting.
So this case, actually, we went to a formal hearing. It was scheduled, and then when the respondents came, the their attorney decided that they wanted to have some discussion about a consent agreement. And so that's the route that we went to. And the penalty was a surrendered broker's license for 2 years to immediately reinstate as a sales associate, a $6,000 fine, and 6 hours of continuing education. I do want to discuss the ramifications for, so we also had the option of taking the brokerage license also.
Okay.
And so the firm, and something that we have to consider when we're discussing a surrender of a license or revocation is who that impacts. And in this case, if we were to also take the firm's license, it would have impacted, I want to say like 15 or 20 agents that were in that office that didn't do anything wrong. And so we decided to have the broker surrender her license, and then someone within the brokerage was a broker associate and ended up stepping in to manage that office. And so those are the things that we have to consider when we're talking about something as serious as a surrender or revocation of who that would impact, maybe unintentionally. So
What would you say the big lesson that they could take away from case study number one to not do or to make sure they do?
well, I think that, verbal negotiations or agreements are not contracts. And in this situation, there should have been a hard and fast executed cancellation before that second contract was executed.
Got it. So get it in writing or else it's not real.
Sure.
Get it in writing and signed.
And even this was a seasoned broker who had been in the business a long time. And, even they make mistakes like this. And it was also at a really weird time. People were really desperate. And so things were moving really quickly. And I think that that's also the lesson too, is that no matter how quickly things are moving, make sure that you're always doing the proper thing in the transaction.
Good advice. So we'll move on to case study number 2. This one has to do with failure to disclose beneficial interest. And we've released some videos about this. So tell us about this case. What happened here?
So, something to remember is that if maybe a transaction didn't go perfectly or quite as planned, the buyer's going to assume that the professional in the situation did something wrong. And in this case, this was a purchase that actually closed. And then after the fact, the buyer just sort of wasn't feeling good about the way that the transaction was handled and started asking some questions, and in his own investigation found that the title company that he was pressured to close at, those were his words, was actually owned by the brokerage in which facilitated the purchase. And so in this case, he filed the complaint, and the buyer or seller in these kinds of situations, once they find out something after the fact, they're going to make a lot of assumptions about things that maybe the professional didn't do correctly. And so upon investigation, the broker did actually own the title company, and he did actually seek legal advice about this and the disclosures that he should have been making. And his legal counsel advised him that he only needed to disclose this in writing to a seller and not all parties. And so this was a situation that had happened a few times prior to our investigation being conducted. And once once we were once we made him aware that that needed to be disclosed to all party, there was a disclosure that was made.
So now you can download that from the work website.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
fill that out anytime that you have beneficial interest. So what were the penalties on this and uh, the ending result?
Yeah, the broker was fined $5,000 and the sales associate was fined $1,500. I think the other part of this to remember is that um, saying that it's required to close at a certain place is probably a really bad practice. And so I would always avoid using the term that it's required to close at any one certain place.
What are some other beneficial interests that you're seeing in investigations?
So all these licensees are out there like moving and shaking. So they own a lot of sort of ancillary companies, like maybe it's just a contractor type situation, a subcontractor type situation, that they own a company that's maybe doing some repairs. We've seen um, pest control companies, we've seen heat and air, we've seen roofing. So anytime you own one of those other companies that maybe is servicing a transaction, you're going to make some money over here, you should be disclosing that to all parties.
Okay,
That's the important thing, all parties.
perfect. Case study number 3. This one is failure to disclose familial relationship and paid commission for a down payment.
Yes. So this case is actually a little bit older. I think it actually closed out in 2022, but I think it's really important for our licensees to hear about this case. So the broker actually self-reported this situation and didn't find out that the agent paid a down payment out of her commission until the HUD was received. And so the sales associate was related to the buyer in this case. It was immediate family, so it needed to be disclosed in writing, and it was not. And there was no disclosure on the contract or any addendum or anything like that that indicated that. There was also no indication that the intention was to pay this down payment on any kind of addendum or in the purchase contract. And so the broker didn't catch it until after it closed, and there was a settlement statement that she was looking at and panicked, and she self-reported this, and so immediately, and so it was dismissed.
And the penalty on that was 3,000.
Yes.
So
And I
when,
believe that was the amount of the down payment also.
okay, well, that would make sense.
Yeah.
So when a broker finds something like that, or a licensee, whether a sales associate, provisional sales associate, broker associate, uh, what is self-reporting the best route for them to go?
Of course, that would be my advice is to self-report. I think that also the commissioners consider those kinds of things when they are assessing a penalty, and they take all of those things into consideration. I think an important thing to remember is that in all of these consents, we look at every single case differently. We look at all of the factors. We try to be pretty consistent with our penalties, depending on what the violation is. But a lot of the times we have to consider certain things, and like in this case, we considered that the broker self-reported as soon as she was made aware. So
This next one is failure to respond. So what do they not respond to,
okay,
and why?
so we get, last year, we received about 600 complaints. And so we vet every single one of those complaints that come through, and we won't open it unless we think that there's some merit. Another thing to remember is that the consumer really doesn't know what they don't know. And so sometimes we'll get complaints and it will seem like there's absolutely a violation here. We need to get more information. And in this case, the seller was just confused. They were dealing with someone who had a real estate license, but they were acting as a purchaser. And so they weren't acting in the capacity of the licensees. They were purchasing through an entity that they owned, which is fine. But there was just a lot of confusion and some miscommunication. And so when the complaint came in, they filed the complaint against the licensee and the brokerage with not very much other information. And so we opened the case, attempted to get a response. Here's another lesson: update your contact information, because it makes us really angry if we can't find you, if we can't get a hold of you. So always update your contact information, because this was probably a situation where the case didn't need to be open, but we couldn't get a hold of the respondent. And so we opened a case. This probably could have been settled with a phone call, but we needed to send them certified notice. And once we got the information from the licensee, we were able to determine that this was a private purchase and that it didn't have anything to do with them having a license. They disclosed that they had a license, but they didn't respond. And so when we have to track them down after they get a notice and don't respond, that's a problem. And last year, I think we had 3 or 4 of these same types of situations where a phone call probably could have handled this, and it ended up being a $500 fine because they just didn't respond. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this case, is that this can be absolutely avoided. Most often, we're able to close cases out as soon as we get a response, because you guys are really good at documentation and most often do the right thing. And so always respond if you get a notice. It will save you $500. I think that penalty will probably go up. It's been a bit of a problem. So always respond. Even if you don't know exactly what to say, call us and we'll help you through the process if you ever get a notice.
And you can update your information through the license portal. And that we've had some people say that they aren't getting the monthly newsletters. And that is, we pull that list every month from your license portal. So log into the website at orec.ok.gov and make sure that your phone number, your email, your address, all of those things are up to date so that we can contact you. Okay, let's move on to case study number 5. So this one was failure to disclose and paid earnest money for the purchaser.
So this case actually started with a complaint that ended up not even being in our jurisdiction. And in investigating that complaint and auditing a few transactions, I noticed that there were some discrepancies in the buyer on the contract versus what was recorded at the county, who actually bought this property. And these were contracts, as all our contracts are, and it was not assignable without a further written agreement by all parties. And that was the piece that was always missing, was that further written agreement, which for me would be an addendum that says, this is going to be assigned and all parties agree to it. And that was the thing that was missing. And so I just kind of kept digging and ended up auditing about 200 transactions and found that in like 24 of those, either the broker actually purchased these properties and no one knew that it was the broker, or earnest monies were paid by the broker. This is a case that I could probably spend an entire hour talking about. It took a really long time, but I think that the lesson here is that once we kind of start looking into something that doesn't look right, we're probably going to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And so that's what happened in this case, is that once, you know, something was found that wasn't right, we just kept looking, kept looking, kept looking. This broker was suspended for 18 months to reinstate his sales associate and assessed a $40,000 fine. He had one associate in his office. She was also fined, and she has to take retake the broker's test. And this brokerage was actually suspended as well. And so there was only one agent in the office, and so we felt like that was something that needed to happen. I think that this particular case was a file auditing nightmare, because when you think about when we audit files, we're looking to connect all of these dots, and that's what we would expect to see. If the closing documents had a different purchaser on it than the purchase contract, then we would expect to see an additional item in that file that said who it was going to be assigned to, and that all parties agreed to that. I think that it's a little bit of a problem with some title companies too, in that some of these assignments were done at the closing table and not all parties were aware of it. And so I think that anytime a buyer is also a licensee and has interest in purchasing a property, they should be disclosing that immediately. And next year, our rules will kind of shore that up, in that has to be done in writing, like all of our other disclosures do now. So, and it's to protect the public. They need to know who they're working with. They need to know if the person they're working with is a professional, because they might handle the transaction differently. They might get their own representation. And so I think that's why those disclosures are always important.
So we're going pretty quickly, so I'm going to ask you some other questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
What has been the most interesting investigation that you've had at your time at the commission?
It was probably this one that we're discussing, just because it took so long, and it was
How long did it take?
a couple years.
Wow.
And it just took so much time. It was just such a volume of documents that I was going through. And so I think that this was for sure the most in-depth investigation. We have some pretty interesting complaints that come into some that don't end up even going anywhere. Like I said, we had 600 complaints last year. And of those complaints, this is an estimate, but it's pretty close. Of those complaints, we had about 100 that actually ended up in disciplinary action. And so 600 complaints, 100 disciplinary actions. There's a lot of fluff in between those two numbers. And we get complaints about appraisers. We get complaints about lenders, home inspectors. I mean, you name it. We get the complaints because it's really easy to file a complaint on our website, and that's okay. That's part of our job, but we take a lot of time to make sure that these complaints are even our jurisdiction. And so that's why there's such a discrepancy in that number. But I do think our licensees should rest easy knowing that we do vet every single complaint that comes in, and we're not going to open it unless we think that there might be an issue.
What are you seeing as like the main compliance issue in the last, let's say, 6 months?
I think that advertisements are always going to be sort of rolling in as far as complaints go. Sales associates, broker associates, all advertisements should be approved by the broker. And I think that it's really easy to make a Facebook post or an Instagram post, and it's important to remember that all of those things need to be done through the supervision of your broker, because they're going to get in trouble too most of the time. Aside from the occasional dismissals, most of the time, if an agent gets in trouble, the broker is going to be charged with failure to supervise. And so that's why those things are in place, is sort of go up the chain of command.
What's one piece of advice that you would give licensees to avoid disciplinary action in an investigation?
Well, I would say to know the code and rules. You're responsible to know that. The prohibited dealings, those are things that you need to know. There's educational offerings about those things, and I think that that's super important for agents to know. And again, things need to be discussed with your broker. Anything you do needs to be discussed with your broker as far as your real estate business. When complaints come in, that's usually the first thing that we ask a complainant. We'll ask if the brokers are made aware of this issue, because if this issue can be handled with two brokers having a conversation, that's exactly what we would like to happen. So that we're not dealing with 600 complaints. Last year, I think there was 115 of those complaints were filed by licensees against licensees. And I've said this before, I think that there's kind of a lack of cooperation happening right now. And I don't know why, if it's just the way the world is, but I really think that brokers should be having conversations with each other before it gets to the government. In my mind, I'm like, the government should be the last place we want to go, and all of these other steps should be taken prior to that happening.
Do you think that it's a communication issue with like maybe texting, things being misinterpreted instead of picking up the phone?
I do. I think that being in the business every single day, our licensees lose sight of what the consumer knows. And even a consumer that has, purchased a few things throughout the year, or has purchased more than, a few things throughout the year, they don't know what you guys know. And so I think it's really important to be walking them through the steps of every transaction so that they know what to expect.
Okay, I'm going to see some questions that have come in. This person said, how do you monitor that a new broker does not loan their license to the previous principal broker?
It's hard for us to monitor those things unless we get a complaint. We aren't out there in the way that you guys are, and so like that, or with trends that are happening in the market, we really don't know unless you guys tell us.
So the answer to that question is file
a complaint or email us, and we'll kind of walk through what that process looks like, but we really don't know those types of things unless somebody makes us aware or until it's too late and something bad happens. And then we absolutely have to move forward.
I think that there was one more case that you sent me that you said if time permits.
Let me think. It was, oh, so this is kind of a best practice type situation. So an agent had a listing and it immediately got off on the wrong foot. You can kind of tell when that's about to happen, when it starts off really bad. And so the seller decided he wanted to cut ties. And instead of best practice probably would have been for if there was a fee to cancel the listing agreement, probably should have been in the listing agreement. Most of the time, a seller is going to file a complaint if after the fact they want to cancel and then a fee is thrown out. And so in this case, that's what happened. The seller did not end up agreeing to it, but instead of presenting them with a cancellation with a proposed fee, it kind of ended up being a bit of a extortion type situation where it was, I'll release it if you pay me this amount of money, and if you don't, the fee is going up in a week. So, of course, that was not the best practice.
Right.
And so the lesson in that is that if your brokerage requires a fee to cancel a listing agreement, it should probably be made a term in the listing agreement up front so that all parties know. We get so many complaints where the consumer's like, I didn't know. Well, if it's right there in black and white and they agreed to it, they signed, then at that point, our hands are tied in a lot of cases. If we can prove that this term was given to them and they agreed upon it, then our hands are kind of tied as far as, claiming that you guys didn't do your job. And so that's my advice on that. If a brokerage is going to have any kind of fee for canceling a listing agreement, I think that it should be transparent and it should be upfront so that there aren't any disputes on the back end if there's any issues.
Okay. If you guys have questions for Riece, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. Okay.
We have been having some confusion as far as teams go. I think that that's probably another situation where it could be an entire hour on itself. But again, that's a reminder that the consumer doesn't know the inner workings of your business. They don't know what the breakdown is behind the scenes. And so they need to be aware of who they're working with and who the broker is in those types of situations where you might have a team within a brokerage. So I think that that's something that we're probably going to have to address in the future with a little bit more education. But we are seeing a bit of an uptick in just confusion about what a team is, who do they belong to, who's in charge of this situation. So I think that it needs to be abundantly clear who the broker is and who to go to if there's an issue in a transaction.
And like with anything else, having team agreements in place.
Yes.
Okay, so somebody asked, as a broker, how do you enforce and avoid violation and fines of social media when you believe that you have properly educated associates? Do you recommend a signed social media policy?
I think that anytime you have an internal policy that somebody has agreed to, it's probably helpful. I also think that when we talk about a failure to supervise violation, we're we try to be reasonable about that. And so if somebody in your office has made a social media post that is a violation, we always look at how long it was up, was it addressed immediately? Because supervision for us doesn't mean you see into the future or you can look into the past about something that's happened. It means that once you were made aware of it, you addressed it properly. And then prior to, you offered some trainings, you had some agreements in place. And so used to, the failure to supervise violation was every single time. And I think now we are really looking at, did they actually supervise and what does that mean?
This question is, what are the majority of complaints that you're seeing with wholesalers, if any? Have the most recent changes made a difference?
I think that, just to be transparent, the most recent changes have just made them go a little bit more underground. Um, we we actually have a few cases that are on the books that have been um, taken care of so that we can kind of use them as case studies. One of them was just the typical, somebody was advertising a property publicly that they didn't have title to, and that ended up being a consent agreement and a fine. Then we had another one where the agent, who was a licensee, almost did it right. And because of the new law, if you publicly market an equitable interest, it's it requires a license. It's a licensable activity. And so this agent, instead of marketing it through his own brokerage, actually got another agent to put it on MLS, and it wasn't disclosed. He also filled out the disclosures, which he should not have done because the owner should be doing that. And so he almost did it right. It would have been okay and it would have been legal had he not filled out the disclosures and marketed it through his own brokerage. Then that would have been completely legal. I think that the trend now that's happening is, one of our licensing exceptions is now they're getting homeowners to execute a power of attorney, allowing them to sell their property, which is a licensing exception now. And so it's one of those situations where we're just kind of chasing the new thing and trying to our best to protect the consumer. The consumer needs to know who's purchasing their property and what that process looks like.
Okay, we got a question of that. Will this be recorded and sent afterward? Yes, it'll be uploaded to YouTube. We can send the link out. And if you're watching on your phone, when I pull up this QR code, take a screenshot of it, and you can take a picture of that screenshot later to submit for your CE. This one says, I'm a new agent in Oklahoma. Is there a section to add beneficial interest on the contract like there is in Texas?
We have a new standalone form that can be used for beneficial interest, familial relationship, and ownership interest, I believe.
I think that's right.
Yes. So we have a new standalone form for that.
Send out the recording. Does a broker have to sign every offering contract for a new build before the purchaser signs?
I would need more information on that.
You might submit your question again with more information. What about a licensed wholesaler never telling us they are a wholesaler until we read their fine print on the additional broker documents they said we would also sign? We probably need.
I mean, that sounds like maybe an addendum that made them aware that it was going to be an assignment. I think that's the language to look for when you're dealing with wholesalers is assigns.
So if a distant family member works at a title company, no other affiliation, would you need to use the form if a client chooses that title company?
So the way that we would look at that, beneficial interest would mean if you're making money in another aspect of the transaction. And so in that case, unless you're filing the same tax return, it doesn't sound like that would be an issue. Sometimes when it comes to small town stuff, it's best just to let everybody know so that they can maybe make a more informed decision. When it comes to complaints about that type of thing, that's what the consumer is angry about. They their complaint is that had I known that information, I might have made a different decision in this transaction. And so that's the complaint that the consumer always has, especially when they find out after the fact. They think that they should have been made aware. Maybe they would have chosen another title company. Maybe they would have used a different contractor had they been made aware of this relationship.
Okay, this one came in. After seller has filled and signed a disclosure at the time of listing and left something blank or didn't answer a question, can a broker send it back to the seller to complete? Or after buyer and seller has signed off on it, can broker send it back to be completed by seller?
I think once both part, I'm not an attorney. I think once both parties have executed the document, then they've agreed to the terms. And so best practice in that situation would be for the listing agent to send it back if it's not completed properly.
Have them fill it out again.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a statute of limitation on how long you have to file a complaint?
There is not. We, as most of you know or should know, there's a 5-year rule for record retention. And so once it gets past that point, it's really difficult for us. And so there isn't a statute of limitations, but again, that 5-year rule would make it a challenge for anything that's 5 years and older. There are statutes of limitations when it comes to OAR, filing a complaint with OAR. And so sometimes people get those two things mixed up, but you do have to move a little bit quickly with them. I think it's 6 months. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, from the time of the incident. And then civil court, of course, there would be a statute there, but not for the real estate commission. We received a complaint yesterday about an incident that happened in 1980.
Is that a record?
Yeah, I think that's the oldest one.
That would have been when Connie was here.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Do you find that you have more complaints when using forms from Oklahoma or forms that brokers create themselves?
Well, we always prefer our forms. We would love for everybody to use the same forms. I think that it would be ideal education wise, and it's really challenging for the investigators too if they're looking at lots of different things. We typically don't see forms that brokers just make up. We typically don't see that. We see contracts from builders. When it comes to commercial transactions, we don't hardly see any commercial complaints at all. And so I don't know what other situation a broker would be sort of making up their own forms.
Yeah. Okay, so Steve said 180 days for code of ethics complaints, and Jeff said that's correct on OAR, 180 days. And thank you, Krista, for chiming in as well. Okay, so that is going to wrap up our web.